So good morning, everyone. I know that people are still signing in, but for sake of time, we will begin. So Scott, to you.
Thank you, Ashley, and good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are privileged to have address us Dr. Brian Abery and Dr. Renáta Tichá, both from the Research and Training Center on HCBS Outcome Measurement with the University of Minnesota. Their extensive biographies were included in our invitation, so I'm not going to go over them in full. But Brian has a doctorate in educational psychology. Renáta has a doctorate in special education. Both have spent many years looking at the quality of services provided to folks with disabilities. They are currently working on a set of metrics to measure the quality of services provided under the HCBS waiver. And they're going to talk to us today about the work that they're currently on. And so before I turn it over to Brian and Renáta, I know that a lot of folks that have joined this webinar, signed up for this webinar, are not yet members of Together for Choice. What we're presenting today is just a sample of the programming that we provide. Last week, we had Melissa Harris from CMS speak to us. And we provide lots of programming and lots of advocacy on behalf of folks with intellectual disabilities. And for those of you on the webinar today who are not members of TFC, I ask you to please become members and to support our mission and our work. And with that, Brian and Renáta, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time talking to you today about the work that we're doing and a little bit of an introduction as to why we think measurement is so important and why we are taking the approach that we are taking at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration in order to develop what we hope will be measures that providers and family members can use to make informed choices and decisions about services and supports, and that will also allow us to better understand what we can do to improve the quality of outcomes for the people with disabilities who we all support. So before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about the fact that Renáta and I are not doing this work on our own. We have a wonderful team supporting us, including our colleagues at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration, Steve Kay from the University of California, San Francisco, a number of colleagues from Temple University, the Ohio State University, and Brandeis University. We are funded by NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, and the Administration on Community Living. What we're going to do today is, again, start off by talking a little bit about the importance of measurement, especially as it relates to home and community-based services. And then we're going to kind of go through the phases that our group has gone through in order to develop what we think will be an improved set of measures that providers can use to improve services and families can use, and people with disabilities to look at the outcomes of services. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about the field study that we are currently doing in order to provide evidence that these measures are adequate enough to be used within systems. So we will also provide at least a half an hour for your questions. So as Ashley indicated, you can just type them into chat and we will basically deal with those questions as we move into that question and answer session. So I guess the first thing we would like to talk about is, the why. Why should we be measuring home and community-based services outcomes? And that really varies with, the stakeholder group that you're a member of. If you're a state, you should want that information for quality improvement. You should want that information to make sure that you're in compliance with CMS regulations. including the HCBS final settings rule. You know, in Minnesota, we need high quality measurement because we are under an Olmstead agreement with the federal government, and the state needs to be able to demonstrate that the changes that it's making in services and supports is actually leading to the increased inclusion of people with disabilities. And then finally, most states want to be able to compare their outcomes with other states, not just from a competitive basis, we're better than you are, but also to make sure that, you know, each state is definitely on the right track to quality improvement. Now, for people with disabilities and their families, you know, we think high quality measurement is critical so that they can compare the outcomes that people with disabilities who are served by different provider agencies experience, you know, and use that information to promote informed decision-making. It's kind of the same reason why managed care organizations are arguing for better HCBS outcome measurement. And also we think the information that can come out of this, you know, is really important, you know, so that it can be used by advocacy organizations and self-advocacy organizations to more effectively advocate for more funding, better services, and better outcomes. And then I know that many of you are from provider agencies. You know, you want to be able to assess the effectiveness of your services and see whether the programming that you're providing, the supports that you're providing, you know, are helping people with disabilities achieve the lives that they desire. You may also want to compare how you're doing compared to other providers in your state and other states. And then finally, for quality improvements purposes, you know, we really want to be able to make more informed decisions about the supports and programs that we're providing to people with disabilities so that, you know, we can be assured that these services and supports are within the limitations that we all work under, the best that we can provide. So what is the current status of HCBS outcome measurement? Well, Renáta and I got interested in this area primarily because we were disappointed. We were disappointed with the current state of measurement in this area because we didn't think it was doing for families and providers what it really needed to be able to do. You know, what we found as we started getting into this is that, you know, most measures focus more on compliance at the state and federal level, and that there were few tools that were, you know, adequate to really help an agency or provider make decisions about its programs and services and supports, or for individual decision making. You know, we also found, much to our chagrin, that the large majority of those tools, even those that have been used for many years, do not currently have sufficient research behind them to support their use in decision making. And we're using, you know, the outcomes of these measures, you know, to make really important decisions that affect people's lives and the lives of their families. You know, so we should be able to be confident that those tools have the research to back them up. We also know from examining these tools that, you know, oftentimes that they're based on assessing the outcomes that people with disabilities and families view as most important. Oftentimes they are really pretty much gauged at answering questions at the state or federal level. Individuals who are at the administrative level want questioned, as opposed to really assessing outcomes that are critical to people with disabilities and their families. And then finally, we found that most of these measures are not person-centered. You know, they really are not based upon what people with disabilities and their families want the individual's life to be like. You know, so for example, you know, oftentimes people are measuring an individual's community inclusion merely by counting the number of times they go into the community each month. Now, we all know that that's not how we experience community inclusion. It's also not the way that the people with disabilities who we serve experience it. So those four shortcomings of current measurement really got Renáta and I thinking about how we really needed to make some changes in how we assess outcomes and the quality of services and supports people get through home and community-based services. So the driving principle behind the last 5 years of work that we were done, you know, really is to improve the way that we measure the quality of home and community-based services and the outcomes that people with disabilities, a whole host of disabilities, experience. You know, and we have a very broad kind of charge or set of responsibilities because that group includes not only people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but people who have physical disabilities of all types, those that they've experienced throughout life, such as cerebral palsy, spina bifida, those that they've acquired, such as a spinal cord injury. We're responsible for developing measures that can be used with people with traumatic brain injury, serious mental health challenges, and age-related disabilities. So it's a broad charge that we have, but we think over the last 5 years, we've made significant progress in achieving what we do hope to achieve with respect to our measure development. Renáta?
So as we thought about measure development and also for you in the field, when we think about the use of measures and measurement, we need to take into consideration several components. So this figure has them visually, but I'm going to go through every one in a little bit more detail. So we need to, the first thing, and when we work with agencies and with other entities, the first thing we ask, why do you want to measure something? What is your purpose? Because that will then determine the selection of measures and how you're going to use those measures in your work. Then we need to look at importance of the measures or the outcomes to stakeholders. So the outcomes that you want to measure, do they matter to anyone? Do they matter to the person with a disability? Do they matter to the family member? And so we have to look at that. Addressing current gaps, Brian already went over that. Identifying critical constructs based on current research and theory. So that's something we found is that in adult services for people with disabilities, a lot of the measures that are in the field have not taken into considerations decades of research and theory, but rather just come up with questions and administer them without any backing. Person-centeredness, Brian talked about that. Evidence-based. And so we need to look at, especially as consumers of measurement, we need to make sure that the questions we are asking have been tested previously and have been found to actually provide reliable and valid, accurate, and consistent information. Procedures. So with different measures, different assessments, procedures are different, you know, in person, interview, online, survey. And so really figuring out what's going to be accessible to your target population. And finally, whether the data are meaningful and actionable. And so the data that's coming out of the survey or the interview at the end of the day, is it really going to inform anything? Can you use it? That is the bottom line. So going back to purpose, there are multiple purposes, of course, and you have to figure out what really works for you. So the basic one is compliance with CMS regulations. So that's out there, that needs to be done. There are assessments out there, for example, national core indicators and others that one can use to do that. Assurance of service quality. And that can be at many different levels. The one that we have focused mostly on in our center is the provider level. And at that level, currently, there are not many tools that we can use that are evidence-based that are available. And quality of life, of course, at the individual level. That are out there, and we'll talk to you about a database that you can look for certain assessments that you're looking for. Importance of stakeholders. Again, are you trying to assess because it's important to CMS, because it's important to family members, because it's important to the person with a disability, or several of those? And so that's something you need to determine before you select your measures. Addressing current gap, Brian has gone over some of those shortcomings in the field currently when we are looking at selecting our measures. based on research and theory. So just to give you one example, one of the measures that we have developed and are currently testing is the measure of choice and control. And there are several measures out there that you can use, but we have paid a lot of attention to the 35 years of work, for example, that Brian and us at the University of Minnesota, but also our colleagues at Kansas have done on self-determination that includes choice and control. And so making sure that we are taking that research over the 30 years that was conducted and incorporated it into the measures that are, we can call them state of the art. Person-centeredness. When our center got funded, this was one of the major provision of the funding that we received for measure development. It was stated that even though there are some measures for compliance, there are not sufficient number and quality of measures in the field that really focus on the need of the person. And so ask the questions in a way that the person can respond to, or a proxy responder if the person has a very significant disability. Those measures and measures we have developed specifically for this purpose are really getting at what is important to the individual rather than just what's important for the individual, which we have done for years. Looking at person's dreams and goals, their wishes, their preferences, but also what kind of supports they require. Evidence-based. So this is kind of a sticking point in a lot of our conversations. And for us and also for the field, it's very, very important that we do not waste people's time. And so we waste people's time when we use measures that do not produce data that is accurate and consistent. Therefore, it's better not to measure anything if we don't have tools that really comply with some of these guidelines for science and science measurement. So we need to have measures that are reliable, valid, hopefully sensitive to change over time, and also specific to different target populations. So for example, if you have someone with a mild intellectual disability, probably there will be some difference in measurement than looking at measuring outcomes of a person who has very significant physical and multiple disabilities. And so not only when you're developing measures, but when you're using measures, you need to check if measures have been tested for these qualities.
And I think to add just one piece to what Renáta has been saying, one of the things that we have found is that the large majority of measures that are out there to assess home and community-based services, outcomes, and the quality of services and supports do not have what we and measurement organizations across the United States believe is adequate research evidence to support their use in making important decisions about people's lives.
I think we have already covered that. Accessibility. So this is the piece about if you as an organization or a provider want to implement measures, are they accessible to your target population? So is the person going to be able to respond to the questions? Are they too complex? Is the measure really designed to be answered by administration within the organization? Who is the respondent? How long is the measure? How long is it going to take to actually answer these questions? Are the response options understandable to the person? Will it provide reliable data at the end of the day? And does the measure allow for proxy respondents when the person is not understanding the questions or they have other barriers to answering them? And finally, it's this meaningful and actionable data. And so the data that comes out of the interviews or the surveys that you are going to use for your assessments, is it really going to answer your question? So if your question is, to what extent does my agency support the choice-making and decision-making of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that's the kind of data you need to get out of it at the end of the day, rather than data on meaningful activity. So just making sure that you are getting the data that you need.
So as we thought about and as we've gone through this process, we wanted to make sure that the measures that we were developing, really were based upon the principles that Renáta just viewed. And we don't think that measures should be released for use, until, they have been evaluated against those stated principles. Now, we do understand that it's possible that, we may need to use different sets of measures for different levels of measurement, compliance, quality assurance versus quality improvement, as well as for different target populations. That is one of the things that we'll be determining in our national field study. But right now, we don't know that, and we really do need to wait and see what the data tells us, what the evidence tells us. And I think that's probably something that has differentiated this center from other developers of HCBS measures, is that we're following what the data and the evidence tells us. So we have, through this process, been going through a series of phases, which we have used to, help us better understand what's needed in the field and how we can develop measures that will basically speak to the needs of people with disabilities, family members, providers, and states. I'm not going to say that we are always in agreement with our colleagues from CMS, with our colleagues from the Administration on Community Living. We have a specific take on measurement, specifically that it needs to be evidence-based and it needs to be person-centered. That hasn't always been supported by other organizations, so I think they are starting to come around to that way of thinking. But what we've tried to do is implement this multi-phase process, which has really allowed us to kind of better understand what we need to do to produce high-quality measures that are reliable, that are valid, and that are actionable. And we're going to spend just a little bit of time going through kind of some of these phases of our measure development to let you know how we've done it, and really to demonstrate that, this is a fairly complex process and a time-consuming process. I know that at many agencies, many providers, especially MCOs, have asked us, can you help us develop a measure of X, Y, or Z? And we say, would be happy to help you do that. And then they'll say, well, we need it by the end of this quarter, and that's in 6 weeks. That's not good measure development. So we'll tell you a little bit about how we went about this process. Our first phase of our work was based upon and was an extension of the work of a group called the National Quality Forum. Now, the National Quality Forum was a group that back in 2015-16 developed a quality measurement framework for home and community-based services. And that outcome measurement framework included 11 different domains: choice and control, protection of human and legal rights, community inclusion, equity of services and supports. And within each of those broad 11 domains, 2 to 7 subdomains. So in the area of community inclusion, there's a subdomain that's referred to as meaningful activities. There's a subdomain that has to do with social connectedness, one that focuses on employment. Now, we like this approach because it really is the only home and community-based service outcome measurement framework that was out there at the time. But we had some problems with it in the sense that it hadn't been vetted with the people who it's going to have the most impact on: people with disabilities, families, and providers. It was developed by a set of experts in the area, but they didn't take the time to go out and really see whether this framework had content validity. So what we did kind of in the first phase of our work is to take this framework out to the people. And we conducted a series of, we call them participatory planning and decision-making meetings with people with all 5 of those types of disabilities, family members of people with all those types of disabilities, provider agencies, and program administrators at the state and the national level. And what we did is we presented this outcome measurement framework to them. And we asked them to take a look at it, add things to it if they thought there were things that were missing, take things out of it if they think they weren't that important, and then to provide us with importance weighting. So we had some direction from the people who, this framework is most likely to have an impact on as to the direction that we needed to go. And so we conducted a series of 58 of these meetings across the country. And I think there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 375 individuals who took part in these meetings. And, the results or the takeaways of this work, were basically that this quality measurement framework was pretty much validated, but there were some things that some people who took part in our meetings told us were missing from the framework. People with disabilities and their family members said, where's employment? I mean, this needs to be a domain in and of itself because it's so important to people, many people with disabilities. They told us that meaningful activities, really didn't encompass all the activities that are meaningful to people with disabilities. And that also needs to be kind of separated out. Transportation was not included at all in this outcome measurement framework. And we were told whether you live in a rural area, a suburban area, or a urban area, if you don't have transportation, and you're a person with a disability living in a resource-rich community, you don't have access to those resources. So you need to take a look at the quality of transportation people have access to. So what our work did was to demonstrate that, this framework is important, has some content validity, but that we might need to apply it differently to the different disability populations with which we're responsible or for which we're responsible. Because there were some differences in how different stakeholder groups, viewed the importance of each of those domains. We do have a webinar on our Research and Training Center website that provides a lot more details about our work in the area and what the results of that work are. I'm now gonna just don't get overwhelmed by this, but this is our revised National Quality Forum framework, which takes a look kind of at that intersection between consumer, provider, and the larger system, and how quality measurement in each of those areas fits into it, including the domains, which are kind of in boldface type, and below them, each of the subdomains that we think measures in some way, shape, manner, or form need to assess. Renáta, I'm going to turn things over to you now, and you can talk about the phase 2 of our research, which focused on the conduction of a gap analysis.
Yes, I'll do that. And I've also been looking at the questions in the chat. I'll try to weave some of that in here, but we can address that in more in depth later. So the gap analysis, the point was that, of course, in the US, we are not the first one on the planet to look at and start developing HCBS outcome measures. There are measures that have been developed that some of them are very well known, like some of you have pointed out, money follows the person, CQL, national core indicators that many of us know. But also there are many measures that were developed at universities, through grants for assessing outcomes to measure an intervention, for example. So we reviewed all of those that we could find. And there were about, as you can see on the screen, 147 instruments. Within those, over 8,000 items. And so we coded all of those. And we did that so that we could kind of figure out what quality of these instruments exists. What we found was that of those domains and subdomains that Brian shared in that framework, a lot of them were covered. For example, choice and control was covered very well, and many others, but there were several like consumer leadership and system development, equity, that were not covered sufficiently at all. So what we did, just so we didn't sit on all this data, this information, we actually developed 2 databases that are publicly accessible. You can access at any time to help you sort through some of these assessment tools. before I go into the database, what we also found was that many of those tools did not have sufficient testing on their reliability and validity. Therefore, the data that you collect through those tools has very questionable quality. Many of the measures and items were not person-centered, so they were very much focused on how the system is working rather than how this is actually affecting the person with a disability. Many of them were large survey tools that had 50, 60 questions that took a long time to administer, something we try to avoid. They were not targeting the levels below state, so providers and individuals. And a lot of the times they were used in the field in ways for which they were not intended. So, and they focused on compliance rather than quality improvement. So that's kind of the big takeaways from the 147 measure review. So here, just you will have access. I'm sure Ashley will make this available, this PowerPoint. You have links to our website that houses the two databases. So one of the databases is searchable. Actually, both are searchable, but the first one that's searchable, you can search for different assessment tools by disability type. You can search by mode of administration. So say survey versus interview. You can search by NQF domain. So if you're interested in tools available for meaningful activity, for example, you can do that. And you can also search for instruments that have some psychometric properties or some scientific qualities behind it. We have a second database that you can access for free through our website. And that is, if you want to know what kind of eligibility tools and outcome measures each state is currently using for people with disabilities. And you may want to do that just for a comparison. You may want to do that just to see what's out there, what states are using in relation to serving their populations. And then our website also has some publications related to measurement. And so based on this analysis, we decided that we wanted to focus on the following domains in which we developed our measures. So you can see in bold there, within community inclusion, we have a measure on community activity, meaningful activity, and social connectedness. Under choice and control, we have got control over daily activities, services and supports, and self-directed services. Then the new domain, employment, opportunities for meaningful employment and employment supports. Under transportation, we have a measure that gets at accessibility, cost, and safety, and then a measure of freedom, abuse, and neglect.
We have a set of other measures that we are developing, which are supplemental to these, which we were asked to develop by the Administration on Community Living. They're not quite at the phase of development of these areas, but those focus on person-centered services and supports and the coordination of supports, person-centered assessment and person-centered planning, and then two additional measures that focus on consumer leadership in system development, design, and evaluation, and the supports that consumers of services are provided in order to be support them to be involved in leadership decision-making. Now, the quality of HCBS outcome measurement is only as good as how those measures are administered, who administers them, what type of training they have, the quality of that training, and then how data is handled after that data is collected from people with disabilities. So in our third phase or study of our research and training center, we basically identified existing outcome measurement programs that were being used to determine the outcomes of home and community-based services and the quality of services. And we conducted a series of 3 case studies of existing quality measurement approaches and programs. And what we tried to do in each of these studies is to identify the similarities and the differences across the procedures and mechanisms used in order to really determine what were best practices in those areas. And we basically looked at 3 of the more widely used approaches, the National Core Indicators, which is used in over 40 states, the Council on Quality Leadership Personal Outcome Measures, which from the standpoint of kind of research and technical quality is one of the best large-scale proprietary assessments or measures which is out there. And IM4Q, IM for Quality, which is used in the state of Pennsylvania and is one of the few measures which has been set up to be longitudinally used so that we can track specific people over time and take a look at the extent to which changes in policy, changes in programming actually move them closer to their desired life outcomes. We have reports that are available on each of these programs, both in extremely kind of brief 1-page, 2-page summaries, a little bit more extensive 5- to 6-page summaries, and then full 25 to 30-page reports if people are interested in them. And those can be accessed off the Research and Training Center website in the area of publications. So we recently completed phase 4 of our work, which basically had to do with kind of the revision, refinement, and development of our HCBS outcome measures, culminating in a pilot study. We went through a fairly lengthy process of developing measures to make sure that they aligned with both the domains that were proposed by our extended National Quality Forum outcome measurement framework and the input that we got from stakeholders, from families, from people with disabilities, and from providers. We developed an initial set of measures that had somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 times the number of items we wanted to end up with. We then took those measures and put them before an expert panel. And those expert panels included content experts, people like Renáta and myself who have done research in the area. It included family members, providers, and people with disabilities themselves. And essentially what we did is we took each of these measures, we sat down with them, we discussed the measures, the questions, we got input from them as to whether we were missing anything, whether there were items or questions that they thought were overlapping and that we didn't need, and information about the quality of how we were asking the questions. We then went through a process of cognitive testing these items with each of the disability groups that we intended to use them with. So we sat down with a number of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we administered the measures, but as we did, we basically probed them and asked them a set of questions. It's called the think aloud method, to try to get a better idea of what they were thinking about when they responded to a question. What we wanted to know from this work was whether the question wording was clear, they were responding to what we intended them to respond to, and whether the response options that we were giving them were providing them with sufficient options to really provide a response that reflected how they felt about something. We will be doing similar testing of this nature with the proxy measures that we have developed, because we know that there are some individuals with disabilities who will not be able to respond for themselves, and we want to make sure that they have a way to have their voices heard.
Right, and there was a specific question in the chat about whether these measures are appropriate for people with complex needs, and that is exactly why we are very open to proxy responding, because we really, one of our major concerns is excluding populations that cannot respond to questions themselves.
And the last piece was piloting these measures. Basically taking a look at their feasibility. How long does it take to administer the measures? Do people understand them? Their usability, are they providing us with information which is actionable? And some of their psychometric properties. We wanted to know whether these measures had internal consistency. In other words, they clustered together and, in a particular area for a particular outcome, the questions hung together, so to speak. whether if the measures were administered kind of 2 times within a short period, whether we got similar responses, we did, and whether if there were 2 people who were part of that administration team, whether they were interpreting the respondents' answers in the same way. And we found out that all 3 of those types of reliability not only met, but far exceeded the minimal psychometric standards and far exceeded the same types of reliability that have been assessed with existing measures of HCBS outcomes that are currently being used. So again, what we ended up doing based upon that is coming up with this series of measures that are prioritized, basically that look at 3 aspects of choice and control, 3 aspects of community inclusion, 2 aspects of employment, and 2 aspects of human and legal rights. One of the things that I should say is that our approach to measurement has been modular in the sense that the CQL, personal outcome measure, the NCI, National Core Indicators, are instruments. They're intended to be administered kind of in the whole, so to speak. Okay, we developed our measures in a modular format so that if a provider was primarily interested in improving services and supports and outcomes related to community inclusion, they would be able to use just the measures of transportation, meaningful activity, and social connectedness in order to gain the information that they needed. We also took a unique approach in developing our measures in that each measure has 2 tiers. The first tier asks some general questions, and these are really kind of screening types of questions that would provide a user with a general idea of outcomes in the areas, the quality of service and support in that area. Then there's a second tier, and that tier kind of delves much more deeply into the concept or the construct, community inclusion, for example, that we're trying to gain information on. And it allows us, I think, to collect sufficient information so that a provider agency could use it to actually make needed changes in the services and supports they provide. A family could use it to make a decision about, is this a provider who I want to go to for supports for my family member with a disability? So the measures are modular in format and have 2 tiers, kind of a general screening tier and a more in-depth tier. And that's 2 of the things that I think really differentiate these measures that are being developed from existing measures. Renáta, would you like to talk a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, and I know we already touched on this a bit, but we really cannot emphasize enough that at what level you need to measure really determines what kind of tool you're going to use. And so really, right from the start, if you can identify whether you're really interested at measuring at the state level, that's mostly for compliance, or at your agency level, or at the level of the individual outcome that is truly person-centered, that will kind of drive your choices. Now, we talked about the level of precision that is required. And if you're going to measure at individual level, so you're interested in Aisha's outcome in meaningful activity, your measure needs to be very, very precise because you're really looking at that individual outcome versus if you're looking at large groups of participants at your agency or you're looking at a large group of participants at a state, the precision, of course, has to be there, but it is not at the granular level as if you are measuring an individual outcomes. And that goes along with kind of the depth of the assessment, the person-centeredness, and whether it's just a global screener that you're looking for general quality assurance and compliance. This is just a kind of a visual for you, the process. Now, you may kind of ask yourself, why are you describing all these tedious steps that you had gone through? But the point is that we took the time, and luckily we had the funding through our center, is to test the measures at every single point. And one reason is that we want to propose or submit our measures for the National Quality Forum endorsement process to be used at a large scale, but also to increase the scientific rigor of measurement within HCBS, because it lags behind vastly other fields that include education, healthcare, and others. So I think we already kind of went over cognitive testing here, so we don't have to do that again. If you just can go to the slide before this one. So the takeaways based on the pilot, we got some really good results that actually are better than we have seen in any other measures in this arena so far. That includes good structure, meaning there is an internal consistency, internal reliability is very high within our measures. They can be administered without any issues. They can be interpreted easily because they are in modular format. You can, if a person is tired after a couple measures, you can stop, you can pick up the next day, or not at all if that's not what you're measuring. And then we use this data for revising our measures going into our big field study that we will just briefly mention next.
Renáta, there are two questions that just came up in the chat that I think we can answer here. One requested clarification as to whether our measures are intended to be used as either independent or dependent variables, or in both a predictive and explanatory model.
Mm-hmm. So even though we call these measures outcome measures, which kind of lends itself to thinking they can only be used as dependent variables, of course, if your hypothesis or your point of this pursuit is to say that people who have more friends or have more connections with friends and family and others will have a higher likelihood to getting a job, for example, you can absolutely use the data from the measures as a predictor. You can also be free to use them as covariates. So a scenario for that would be, let's say you're interested in if the person has a significant level of choice and control to predict their employment levels, and you want to control whether they do or do not have transportation, you can use the transportation measure as a covariate. And so really, it just depends how you are looking at your results and at your data, but they certainly can be used at all levels.
I think a really good example of how it could be used is in one of the supplemental measures or sets of measures we're developing, which focus on person-centered approaches to planning and services. Despite the fact that there are really good reasons to employ person-centered planning from an ethical standpoint, because that's what we should be doing for people with disabilities who we support. There's very little high quality research to indicate that using person-centered assessment, person-centered planning, which is of high quality, and person-centered coordination of services really makes a difference in the outcomes that people with disabilities experience. So the measures on person-centered planning could be used in conjunction with some of those other outcome measures to help determine those types of connections. Renáta, a second question that came up had to do with the requirements to be considered as proxy. Whether we are considering things like the level of involvement in planning supports, regular communication with providers. Is it just a family member? Could it be a support coordinator?
Mm-hmm. So we really try to be inclusive in the selection of the proxy, but really the bottom line for us is for the person with a disability, if they are able, or the people around them, to select who they want to be their proxy respondent. And that's for an obvious reason, because we want to work with a person who knows the person best. So in some cases that will be a sibling, in some cases it will be a support staff. And so we as I said, we really want to be inclusive and address the closeness of the relationship.
Right. The other thing that we have taken into consideration with the administration of our measures, based upon some of the research evidence that is available, is that some people may not be able to respond to questions independently, But if they had a support person there who they chose, to support them in that process, we would be able to get higher quality information from them. That is also something which is supported in our model.
So yeah, we'll just kind of go over our last section here, and then we would be more than happy to answer more questions. So we are currently in this last phase of this pursuit, and that is a large-scale testing of the measures before we release them to the public. And so there are a couple of things we wanted to mention. And that is, we will be testing the measures with great rigor, with over 1,000 participants across the United States. We want to be representative. Our sample will be people 18 years and older with 5 different types of disabilities. And we will be testing them for reliability, validity, discrimination, sensitivity to change. We will also have some variables for risk adjustment we are going to test, and also proxy responses, because we don't want to just assume that proxy can reliably answer every single question on every single measure. We don't think that's actually possible. And then we also, just one little note, we will be administering some of the questions to members of general population who may or may not have a disability, to see whether the outcomes that we expect of people with disabilities match the outcomes we expect for a person without a disability. And we are doing that to avoid this false assumption that people with disabilities should have different norms for choice making, freedom from abuse and neglect, and all the other things that someone who may not have a disability. Now, we need your help. We are still recruiting. We are recruiting participants all over the country to help us administer some of these. Well, I shouldn't say administer, to help us with actually having people respond to these measures that's representative of the country. We are working with providers all over the country to help us identify, anywhere between 10 and 200 participants with different types of disabilities, different levels of supports. And we very much would be happy to engage in a conversation if you're interested in supporting this effort. And you have an email address there for our coordinator, Matt Roberts. We also will have our email addresses at the end of this presentation. We have some support available through the center. Let's say you have your organization that would be willing to coordinate some data collection for us. We do have some resources for the coordinator to help us recruit, to help us kind of organize the time of these interviews, and to actually help us do that. Now, you may ask, what are you doing under COVID? Under COVID, we are doing the interviews currently using video conferencing, using Zoom like we are doing today. And so we would be doing the interviews. We have staff who would be doing the interviews, but we would just need help with some coordination.
I think there's I think there's one other important thing that we should let people know, Renáta, about our field study. And also, I think about the testing of our measures. And that is, as I said earlier, right now there really is only, there's some longitudinal kind of following along of people with disabilities in California and in Pennsylvania. Most of the measures that have been developed have really been developed as kind of one-shot deals. They're not intended to measure progress. Our measures are. And so what we're going to be doing is collecting data from as many people as we can out of this group of 1,000 or 1,400 at 3 different points, so that we can actually take a look to see the extent to which our measures are sensitive to change over time. And I'll tell you why that's so important. In Minnesota, we're under an Olmstead agreement. And the state has invested a lot of money, millions of dollars, in training provider agencies, training person-centered planning facilitators, both in person-centered supports and services, and in positive behavioral interventions and supports. However, the state has selected a tool to see whether change is actually taking place, which hasn't been validated for that purpose, and was actually developed many years ago to take a look at the changes that occurred in people's lives as they moved out of institutions of 500 people into the community. You know, the initial reports that are coming out of the evaluation that's associated with our Olmstead agreement with the federal government are not very encouraging. Unfortunately, because of the tools that the state selected to use, we don't know whether that lack of encouraging results is due to the interventions really not doing what they were intended to do, or because some poor decisions were made in selecting the tool that was going to be used to try to determine whether change was actually taking place in people's lives and they were being included to a greater extent in their communities.
So, as I said, if you would be interested in discussing this further, and as I said, it can be if you have the capacity to support us interviewing 10 individuals, that's great. If you have 150, you know, we can work something out. So we are quite flexible.
Renáta and Brian, maybe you can address the sort of the time that would be involved for folks that may be interested in participating.
Yes. So as you know, because it is a research study, we need to go through the Institutional Review Board at the University of Minnesota, which we have everything together. We will be submitting that next week. And there is about a 2-week turnaround for approval and revisions. So we anticipate beginning data collection in January of 2021. And we can start recruiting probably in December when we have our approval. And then we would kind of do this in cohorts as organizations are ready or have participants for us to start doing the interviews with the measures that we have developed. And then after about 5 to 6 months, we will do the second data collection with the individual. And then, and again, about in 5 to 6 months, do the third data point. We should also mention, even though we don't have a huge sort of incentive as far as the individual with a disability, we have a small $10 gift card available for participation. And so that's kind of how this goes.
I think the other thing.
And how long would you anticipate each interview being?
Based upon the pilots that we have done, interviews really vary in how long they take. I would say that it can take anywhere from as short of 35 to 45 minutes to an hour and a half. One of the things that our interviewers are trained to do is that if people do have stories that they would like to tell about their lives, is to provide some flexibility in allowing them to tell those stories, because we think it's really important for people with disabilities to be heard. I would say most of the individual measures, okay, so an individual measure would be a measure on choice and control, or a measure on social connectedness, take about 10 to 15 minutes to administer. We oftentimes, and we will in our field study, provide the opportunity if our interviewer feels that the person is becoming fatigued, or the person themselves feels that they can't stay engaged, for them to come back and schedule a second interview to complete as many of these measures as possible. But again, these measures are modular, so we don't have to complete all 8 with every individual.
Right.
One of the things that somebody just asked is what percentage of the population are going to be individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're trying to approximate kind of an even distribution across those 5 different disabilities. So I would say somewhere between 200 and 250 people nationally will have intellectual and developmental disabilities, and those others will be split up within the other groups.
Right. And also you may be asking yourselves, what is in it for me? One of the things that we will make very clear, because of course we need to produce a series of technical reports with the data aggregated data, of course, de-identified data on which we have based the evidence of these measures. We would be acknowledging every single organization that helps us, meaning that you may get a question in your state or in your organization, how do you know these measures work for our population? And you can say, well, we helped with the testing. Similarly, if our measures really show good results, good reliability, good validity, and all these good things, we would like them to be. And your state, your organization would like to look at your own data that was collected in an aggregate form, we can certainly work with you to have a peek at the data if that would help in your decision making.
Mm-hmm. There was another question that asked about the types of settings with which we will work. We have some limitations that have been placed upon us by NIDLR and the Administration on Community Living. If the individual is receiving home and community-based services, whether that's in a small residential setting, whether that's in the family home, whether that's in an apartment they share with a roommate, those individuals would be eligible for our study. Unfortunately, individuals who are served in ICFs are not eligible, and that is solely because of the requirements of NIDLR and ACL, which are the funding agencies for this grant.
Right, but that is not to say that once the measures are released, of course, anyone can use them regardless of the setting.
Yeah, and we would be certainly very interested in working with any group, not necessarily as part of this official study, who is interested in doing that, to use them in those types of settings, which we understand are sometimes necessary in order to provide people with adequate supports.
So we just have a concluding slide and then we can open it up for other questions. So just to conclude, the end goal of the initiative is have those measures, about 10 measures available for use by agencies, by states, by families to assess outcomes of people with disabilities. The measures will have been rigorously tested, and so there'll be very little doubt that they are producing the results that they are producing. And we really hope that the measures will push the field of HCBS and outcome measurement forward. We also will be looking to submit the measures for National Quality Forum endorsement for wide use nationally.
And, one of the things that we do want to say is, right now we're developing measures in 10 different areas. We will only release those measures that meet the measurement psychometric criteria for high quality measurement as established by a number of different organizations, including the American Psychological Association. There are tools out there now that have been used, many for significant lengths of time, that don't meet those requirements. And we don't believe that those should be used because we really don't know the quality of the information that those tools are providing us.
So with that, I know there are a lot of questions in the chat and you may have others. So I'll kind of let Ashley decide how to handle these questions, or Scott. Oh, Ashley asked, is your field study only for HCBS recipients? So the field study specifically is primarily for HCBS recipients. There's only one exception to that, which is, I think, mostly in the mental health arena, where often the state will not provide HCBS or not for everyone. And so there are HCBS-like services for the population. But by and large, because of the funding stream, it is for HCBS recipients.
Renáta and Brian, one person has asked, and I think this is a very important question, about will there be representatives from intentional communities that have qualified for HCBS waivers?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
I mean, if individuals qualify through HCBS waivers, they would be eligible for participation. Yes. Yeah. Very much the case.
In fact, I think you guys, tell me if I'm wrong, you would really like to get a wide variety of different settings, all of which qualify for waiver funding, but
Right.
you're not looking, you don't want to have it confined to just one type of setting, but you'd like to have a wide variety of tests. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's one of the major purposes, is to look at the outcomes by different setting type.
Right. There's a question here about health outcomes. One of the things that we actually, again, because of the funding agency, are not attempting to develop are measures that specifically focus on health, even though health and wellness is one of the domains of the National Quality Forum's HCBS Outcome Measurement. That was something which, for whatever reason, NIDLR and ACL prohibited from us developing measures on, and I think that primarily was because of the fact that there are already a lot of measures of health and wellness that are out there that they figured could be used.
Another question is, are you interested only in broad-based populations or specific disorders as well?
So the 5 different disability types we mentioned, so IDD, physical disability, TBI, mental health conditions, and aging, are kind of the broad umbrellas under which we operate. We certainly, we are not going to parse out the results by, say, Down syndrome or spina bifida or something like that, but we are very interested in knowing what kind of a condition the person has within that broad category, so that we can parse out the data if we need to, if we want to.
Right, and I think we're really looking for broad representation, not just with respect to kind of the disability type that the individual has, but also the intensity of support needs that they have, which is one of the reasons why we thought it was so important to include kind of proxy measures, because we know that some of those individuals who, really could use a voice, are not going to be able to provide that voice themselves. We will need to rely on family members or other individuals who know that person well.
In that connection with respect to a proxy, one person has asked, how are you able to make sure that the proxy is really answering for the individual as opposed to for themselves, or that there's no conflict of interest and that sort of concern?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why in this large field study, we are going to have a subsample where we will have the proxy respond to the question, and then we will have the individuals themselves respond to the questions. And I know this is not why the proxy is important, but for this study, we specifically are doing that to look at discrepancies in responding, to uncover some of these biases. So that's kind of one safeguard we are looking at through the study. We also know from research that there are certain areas that are more observable, that are much more reliable by answered by a proxy, versus some of those areas about how does the person feel, what are their experiences with certain things. We know that proxy respondents are not very good at answering those questions. And so we have separated the questions we think are best answered by proxy and questions that are really not a good candidate.
And we have some screeners that we will be using to help determine whether individuals who have been nominated to serve as proxy, have enough interactions with, have enough knowledge about the individual and their life to actually serve as a good proxy. An example we have in some states, individuals who are legal guardians are good proxy. But in other states in which a fairly large proportion of legal guardians are state-appointed guardians or state guardians, who may only see the person once or twice a year at their service planning meeting, those individuals would not necessarily be, the best reporters of what the individual's life is like. So, rather than looking specifically at kind of the roles that people play, we're going to be with these screeners really trying to determine, who the individual would like and who would be the individual who has the most information that they could share about the life of the person with a disability, the services they're receiving, and the outcomes they're experiencing. You
mentioned the 5 categories of individuals that you're looking at. you have a particular percentage in mind of the folks that you want to talk to that have intellectual disabilities?
It would be about 20% of that entire sample. And, that sample size of 1,000, we want to oversample because we realize that we will lose some people, because we're going to be looking at trying to collect the data at 3 points in time. So I would say that, we're looking with the original recruitment at nationally a sample of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities of a minimum size of 350, but if we have additional individuals, from that group and their families who would like to participate, we certainly are going to try our best to accommodate them. We also know that there are some groups which, just because the incidence of the disability is lower, are going to be more difficult to recruit.
And you mentioned that you want to do this on a national basis, and I assume that you may already have participants in some areas of the country, and you may be specifically in need of folks in other areas of the country. Do you want to mention that at all?
Yeah, we are very interested in recruiting individuals from the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington. And I would say from kind of I know there's a new term and I might not be using it, but the heartland of the country. We have some things set up to collect data in Virginia, Georgia, Florida, kind of Massachusetts, hopefully New York, Arizona, but that kind of, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Colorado, Wyoming, and we also want kind of a representation of individuals who live in different geographic areas. We don't want, a sample which is solely composed of individuals who live in urban areas where there tends to be, a much higher clustering of resources and supports, and leave those individuals who, live in rural areas out of our sample. And I would say, because we have had some conversations with people from the state of Alaska and the state of Montana, we also want to include individuals who live in, I think the term that's being used now is frontier areas. One of the main reasons that we started looking at using teleconference approaches to do these interviews, even before COVID reared its ugly head, was because of conversations in those states that, literally have people living hundreds of miles apart, where driving to do an interview with one person in kind of an isolated town, really isn't, something that is getting done, but we still want information about the lives of those individuals.
Yeah, and you mentioned how you're going to deal with the COVID situation in terms of doing interviews by Zoom. But I think there's also the more generalized concern of the COVID environment impacting how people respond to the questions. So how are you going to deal with that? It seems to me you may get responses that are not really accurate in general, but only accurate because it's taking place during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. That would present a problem if we were actually doing this field study, to actually determine quality of services and supports or outcomes. But again, this field study is being conducted to determine kind of the psychometric properties, of these measures. To be honest, if there's anything, and there are very, very few things that are good about COVID, we would expect to be able to see by the time we're doing our third point of data collection, if a vaccine is available and things have started opening up in our communities, it would allow us to see whether when the things change, our measures pick them up. So again, given the purpose of this study, which is determine reliability and validity, we don't think that starting to collect our data in the middle of the pandemic really is going to have any significant negative impact on the conclusions that we can draw.
And of course, we are hoping that at some point this situation will lift and we will have at least our last data point that we can collect both online, but also in person.
And how are you making sure that your participants have sufficient diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, those sorts of criteria?
Okay, as we're working with different states and different providers, there are various ways that you can do sampling. I mean, our approach is really going to be kind of a stratified sampling, so that we will have targets, within specific areas, to basically recruit samples that adequately represent that area. A good example is here in Minneapolis, we have a relatively large population of individuals who are Somali American and Hmong American. We want to make sure that we include those people in our samples. And if we initially don't get enough, we'll be working in our area with community organizations, specifically geared to provide supports to people with disabilities from those communities in order to make sure that they have adequate representation in our sample.
One question that's been asked is, do you have guides on how to measure independence? That is, an independence quotient to see if individuals with disabilities are able to function more independently.
Right. So even though we don't have a specific measure on independence, we are hoping that the way we have the response options set up for all of our measures, we can eventually create an index that will be an indicator of independence. And so we will do that once we have some data. We can then create sort of an index from all the measures.
Right, but I should clarify that that work is primarily being done to help us control for confounding variables in this. We haven't started out with attempting to develop a measure of independence. And one of the things I should say is that, as part of our gap analysis study and the development of our HCBS Outcome Measurement databases, we have found that, states are going about doing this, again, measuring independence, because a lot of that has to do with eligibility decisions. It has to do with case mix and funding decisions, are going about it in an extremely diverse set of ways. Some states are doing it solely using well-validated, well-researched tools. Other states are using tools that have not been validated at all, and our state is one of them. Other states are using a combination of things. We currently work with the developer of two scales of independent behavior, one called the Scales of Independent Behavior Revised, the SIB, and the other called the Inventory of Client and Agency Planning, both of which provide broad independence measures and are used, the last we saw, by 12 or 14 states in order to make eligibility and programming decisions or funding decisions. Unfortunately, those two instruments, which the former president of our university developed back in the 1980s, haven't been renormed for 30 some odd years and shouldn't be used. But when we have talked to states that are using them, they have told us, well, there's nothing better that has really come along. What the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, has developed, the supports intensity scale isn't doing for us what we need. So we're continuing to use tools that unfortunately are outdated and are in desperate need of revamping.
As I think you've observed, some of the measures that are out there now sort of start from the assumption that folks with disabilities are happier when they spend more time with non-disabled folks. And some of our own experiences with our own family members really are to the contrary. That is, our family member may be happier when they spend more time with folks like them. So can you explain to us how your measures deal with that?
Okay, that really is an issue of person-centeredness. And, I think that our measures are different than previous measures, and that they really are person-centered. A good example, we know when we work with a number of people who are on the autism spectrum, and simply counting the number of times they have gone out into the community, in the last month is in no way, shape, manner, or form a good indicator of how included they feel in their community. They may be much more comfortable using a format like this to communicate and interact with people who are also on the autism spectrum, who have similar interests that they do, in direct opposition to, taking a look and judging their community inclusion, based upon the frequency with which they've gone shopping and to a restaurant, or, taken part in an exercise program at the local YMCA. We truly believe that, measures do need to be person-centered, and, the items and the questions that we ask really focus on, whether somebody's social connectedness, whether their engagement in community activities, whether their level of choice and decision-making is meeting their needs and is what they want. And a good example of that has to do with an area that I've done 35 years worth of work in, which is referred to as self-determination. We define self-determination as people having the degree of control they desire over those things in life that are important to them. All of us don't want to make all decisions on our own. We share decision-making, whether it's because we're parents, we're going to an expert who we think has more information about it than we do. I mean, I certainly don't want to go to a physician and have the physician say, here's your diagnosis, Brian, what do you want to do about it? Because I'm not an expert in health, but I do want to be involved in the decision-making, and so, we really feel that this person-centered approach, is the way we need to take a look at this, so we don't end up with standards that are like, every person with IDD needs to have 10 trips to the community over a 30-day period of time. We think that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
It seems to me that a large part of this is letting the individual define their community, as opposed to having somebody else define what community means to the individual. And so do the measures that you've developed, do they allow the person to define their own community? And if so, can you explain how you do that?
Yeah, so I would say we don't specifically ask the person to define their community, but the measures themselves do it the way they design. So just to give you two examples, one is meaningful activity. So the person themselves defines what is meaningful to them. We don't define for them. We don't tell them that meaningful activity means going shopping or, going for a walk around a lake. That's what they define. And then they indicate for us, or for the measure of the agency, to what extent they engage in that activity that is meaningful to them. And then the agency gets a sense whether the person does enough of what's meaningful to them, however they define it. Similarly, with the social connectedness measures, we don't tell them that they need to be socially connected to their mother or, to their coworker. We let them define who they want to be socially connected to. And then we ask them, do you have a sufficient connection to those people you want to be connected to? So in a way, indirectly, Scott, I think it does get to the defining of your community in an indirect way.
Right. A number of years ago, I was working with a group of adults with intellectual developmental disabilities in Minnesota as kind of a supporter of their state self-advocacy group. And I know when, this notion of kind of who gets to make the final choice, comes up, we were talking one day about social connectedness, and, one of the people clearly said, hey, look, we want to select our friends in the same way that you want to select yours. We want to select who we hang out with and what we do as much as, you want to select yours. I mean, we don't want you or anyone else telling us, what we should be doing, who should be doing it with. That's a decision that we want to be able to make. And I think by focusing on person-centered measures and kind of person-centered assessment, we're getting at this to a much greater extent, I think, than previous attempts at HCBS outcome measurement have. There is a question here with somebody asking us whether the study will assess the performance of counties and states and their influence on HCBS outcomes. Again, this study is basically only taking place to validate the measures themselves. They could certainly be used for that type of purpose, but that is not the primary purpose or the purpose at all of the research we are currently doing. We're trying to validate these measures for the uses for which they're intended at this point. But certainly it is a very interesting question. And we know that states and counties do have an impact on HCBS outcomes, based upon the resources that are available to people, and just something as simple as the geographic location of the county or the state.
Right. And actually, in the study, we will be taking into account the characteristics of the region and the state. And so we will really control for, like some of you already noted, of urban versus rural versus frontier. We'll be looking at, for example, the average income of that state, average income of that area. We will be looking at the level of unemployment within that area. So we'll be controlling some of these things so that we make the right conclusions about the characteristics.
And the study itself will take place over about a year period of time. We want to, and as many people as possible, kind of get that baseline, that initial data point, then about 5 to 6 months later, get a second, and then get a third about 6 months after that. Again, that is something which will also make these measures different. Current measures weren't developed to be used in this kind of longitudinal fashion, but we think especially for those of you who are providers, if you're going to institute new policies, new programs, the only way to really tell whether they work is to really measure outcomes at different points in time. And you want to make sure that the tools you're using are sensitive enough so that if you do something positive and it's likely to have a result, the tool will actually pick up on changes that occur in people's lives.
So let me just ask you guys one final question as we're approaching the end of our hour and a half. You just said, Brian, that what you're about to embark on now is going to take about a year, and hopefully at the end of that, you'll have gathered the information you need to validate the metrics that you've come up with. What happens then? What's sort of next? Where do you see this study going? What's your goal for this study ultimately for these set of measures?
No, that's an excellent question, because we're coming about this in a very different way than HSRI, who administers the National Core Indicators, or CQL, which has the proprietary CQL personal outcome measures. We are not looking to become a HCBS outcome measurement organization. What we want to do is develop these measures, validate them. We are developing training programs for individuals who might in the future decide that they want to use these measures. And then we want to give them away, but through our ongoing support as a University Center for Excellence in Disabilities, support providers and states who might want to use these, so that they can use them in a fashion that is indicative of high fidelity. So essentially we want to develop them, validate them, give them away, and then support their use, because we think that by doing that, we have the greatest, we're likely to have the greatest impact on improving the quality of supports people with disabilities receive and their lives.
And I would
Great.
just add that some of you might be aware that CMS is working on putting together HCBS Measure Set Toolkit. We are very much in conversation with those efforts. We want our measures to be part of those conversations. And so getting some data on them is critical for them to be included in this measure set.
Right. And if any of you are interested, there was recently a request for responses to this toolkit that they are trying to put together. As many of you who, if you have strong feelings about HCBS outcome measurement, and the approach that they're taking, please, we encourage you to write responses. We will be probably sending somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 pages of single-space responses to them, because there are some things that they're questioning whether they're important, such as should scientific acceptability of these measures be something that's really important, that we feel very strongly about. When I was recently on a phone call with them, I said that if something doesn't have the data to back it up, none of those other questions you're asking are relevant. We should only be using measures that we know are providing us with valid and reliable information, because the stakes are too high. We're making decisions that are going to cost taxpayers millions of dollars, that are going to have an impact on the lives of people with disabilities and their families. We want to be sure that that information is good information, and we are not just making decisions in the dark.
Renáta, Brian, there's one more question that I would like to address, that there are a lot of individuals that would like their family to participate in the study, and they don't necessarily have a provider to go through. There are a lot of family organizations that have many families in the network that would like to participate. How can they be included in the study?
Yes, so if individual families would like to be part of this, I'm going to put into the chat email for our project coordinator. His name is Matt Roberts. He's great. He would love to hear from you. So I'm just putting in his email address. So please email him, and then he will get you included into the recruitment process.
And
Great.
Feel free to reach out to me as well, the individuals that have asked. I'd be happy to coordinate as well, because Matt and I have been communicating.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes.
Okay, and Ashley, you have a website to put the slides up on, or somewhere where
Yes.
people can access them? Okay.
Yes, we're going to put the slides and the video on the website, and we will email it to everyone as well, and we'll post it on Facebook, so you won't miss it. As long as you don't block me, it's fine. You'll get the email.
Brian
Yes.
and Renáta, thank you so much. I think this was really valuable and very, very interesting. And I think you can tell from the questions that you got that folks really found it interesting and important. So thank you for your time. And we look forward to continuing to work with you on this very important project.
Yes, thank you for your interest in outcome measurement.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Okay.
Thank you
Bye-bye,
so
everybody.
much. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Have a good day.
You too.